Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of our Influencing with Open Education series here at Nelson Mandela University. My name is Gino Fransman, and I will be your facilitator today as we have our session titled the Global Open Educational Resources Graduate Network, or GoGN, Open Research, Insights and Methods. Before we go any further, just some housekeeping that I'd like to share with you. Please note that the session is being recorded. It is on record right now. Have your mics on mute, please. Cameras should be off. Reduce background noise. You don't want to miss the wonderful content and lessons coming in the session. Use the chat feature to enter your questions, please. We will answer and engage with these questions at the end of the presentation, which is about 40 minutes in length. Follow-up questions may be sent to myself, to Kelly or Mlungisi, and I am entering that information into the chat window right now so that it's there for everyone. Just 1 second. Please note that the session is recorded and will be loaded on the Mandela University webinars page, as well as onto the Open Education Influencers YouTube channel. I've entered that into the chat window now. So, about today, influencing with open education is an...
Okay, and I might just switch my camera off as well. Okay, so as Gino said, I'm a researcher at the Institute of Educational Technology in the Open University UK, and in my role, work in a team, we have responsibility for several different open education related projects. But one of the ones that we like the most is GoGN, or the Global OER Graduate Network. So the work I'm going to talk about today is an output from this network, but it's very much a kind of collective output rather than something that I wrote, even though I was the lead author. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. Okay, so just want to give you a very brief overview of the sort of territory that I'm going to try and cover in the next 50 minutes or so. First of all, a bit of background on GoGN and what it is and who the members are. Secondly, a bit of a genealogy for the project. You know, why did we decide to produce a research methods handbook for open education researchers? Then I'm going to take you through sort of how it was put together, and the sort of open approach that we tried to take to production. I'm going to say a bit about the way that we present material in the guide, and how we try to make it as accessible as possible. And then I'm going to talk a bit about, if you like, the sort of meta level to the handbook, which is openness itself as a sort of feature or function of research. And the kind of insights that we've developed into what it means to be an open practitioner in research. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the impact of the handbook and what we've got planned in the future. And then I've got a section at the end to acknowledge all the people who contributed. So first of all, what is GoGN? So GoGN is a network of researchers, some of whom are postdoctoral, but the focus is mainly on people doing doctoral research in open education. And it can be that your function is OER, or it could be MOOC or open educational practices or anything like that. So it's open education broadly construed. But back in 2013, when the network was first started, it was focused very much on OER as the kind of the zeitgeist, I suppose, aspect of open education. So we're funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and since about 2018, I think, the network has been administered from the Open Education Research Hub at the Institute of Educational Technology. And GoGN has three main functions. One is to raise the profile of research in open education. One is to offer targeted support for people doing research at doctoral level, especially when a lot of the time, because open education is a kind of emergent field, there are many people who want to do research in this area, but they can't find a specialist to supervise them. So we offer a kind of complementary support structure around that. And the third aspect is to investigate openness as a process or function or output of research. And we do that by being researchers and exploring and trying stuff. And trying to sort of reflect and understand what is this kind of openness thing that's running through all these different bits of work. So we've got, I think, about 150 researchers in the network, and then there's an additional 200 experts, friends, mentors, interested people, and taken all together, we form a community of practice. So, why a research methods handbook? One of the things that our members would tell us was that they felt like they needed support when it came to research methods. And if you're someone who's either pursued postgraduate study or you've supervised someone who's doing research, you may well relate to this sort of difficulty, because method is not necessarily a sort of simple thing to understand. And what we tried to do in this handbook was to kind of give an explanation for how research methods work, but without being exhaustive and without kind of going into every last sort of complex nuance of it. So to start off with a simple approach, so what is a research method? It's really just what you did to do the research. So the techniques used, how the data is collected, analysis, could be testing a hypothesis, but overall, whichever kind of research method you're using, so whether qualitative, quantitative, whatever, at some level, you're making a tacit claim to knowledge, or at least the validity of your process. So it might be that your research doesn't prove something, but it disproves it, right? So is that a claim to knowledge? Maybe you could argue it, but it's a claim to validity in what you're doing. And that's how it works, at most levels, until you get to a sort of doctoral level. You can just kind of take methods off the peg and just use them, right? And you can still do that at a doctoral level as well, but you're expected to give more of a kind of justification for it. So really, the method aspect is the sort of tip of the iceberg, like the techniques that you actually use. Underlying that is what I would call methodology, so the sort of systematization of methods, the logical examination of methods, and the sort of rational comparison of methods. And then underlying that, we have theories. So theories about how knowledge can be generated, for instance, and what qualifies as knowledge. And what you find is that this soon leads you to a sort of philosophical approach to understanding method, because really what distinguishes different methods are their philosophical divergences. So maybe the most obvious one would be qualitative and quantitative. But what these come down to is differences in what I would term ontology, so your understanding of what there is and what exists; axiology, which is values and the kind of values that inform what you're doing; and epistemology, which is theory of knowledge. So maybe it's easy to see from this how people get into difficulty quite quickly when all they want to do is collect some data and do some analysis, but they feel like all of a sudden they have to understand like what epistemology is or something like that. So what we tried to do was find a way to kind of give people a way into all this stuff. So we have an annual seminar with our members, and we would give people the chance for a one-to-one consultation as part of that. And the thing that often comes up is methods and needing support with methodology. And so one thing, again, which if you've been in that situation, you maybe can relate to, it's easy to feel like an imposter if you don't feel like you know all of this stuff and you don't understand all the different research methods. And that can lead to people feeling like they can't really discuss these things or be open about the fact that they don't feel like they understand all this stuff. So this is where the idea of producing this handbook originally came from. It's like, well, can we produce something that will give people that support when they kind of hit this stumbling block? I think also it's worth noting that because people are doing work in open education, which is a kind of new area of study, there aren't always necessarily well-established methods. And typically you're taking methods used in a different context. It could be education research more generally, which would be quite close, but people do all kinds of creative stuff. When you're applying a method outside of its original use, it can be, again, hard to feel like that you've completely mastered all the implications of that. And I think there's also some question, you know, depending on how you approach open education and open research, you can understand it as a challenge to some of our kind of inherited Western-centric epistemologies and ideas about how to do research. And if you have, you know, people who are trying to decolonize the curriculum and that kind of thing, that can challenge different received ways of doing things. So there's, you know, a confluence, if you like, of different factors here. So we were interested in acknowledging this complexity, but also providing support to address it, and making it very specific to open education research, which actually, you know, there isn't much out there in terms of guidance on how to do open education research. So we were also interested in leveraging the affordances of our own network to produce this. And again, because we've got members from all over the world, and they're working in all kinds of diverse areas. So we had the idea of trying to capture their own experiences as researchers working in open education, and kind of collecting those together and then sharing that back with the community. And so the idea would be that for our existing members, but also for members in the future, so people who are just starting a PhD, for instance, and they want to join GoGN, we've got a kind of entry point for them by, you know, we can give them this handbook and say, look, start here. So yeah, as I say, we wanted to give some indication and a kind of nod towards the philosophical complexities around method when you really get into it, but also to do something practical, just have a practical tool that people could use. And also, I suppose, as a research project in its own right, collecting and sharing these experiences of researchers who are sort of at the cutting edge. So, to just give you the timeline for this work. So we had the idea late last year. In January, we put out a short survey, and we asked people for input into what kind of things they would like to see from this handbook. Then in February, we had a webinar, which again, people had the chance to have input. The original plan was that around the OER20 conference, which is the big UK OER conference each year, we were going to have a sort of one-day session where we were going to invite a bunch of members and have a workshop and try and progress this handbook template a bit further. But 2020 had other ideas, obviously, so that conference moved online. Our workshop moved online and became, I think, about an hour or 2 hours. So that was kind of scaled down in scope. But we asked people for more information about the kind of stuff that they do and how they use different methods in their own work and what the impact of that is and so on. So those were coming in May. By June, we had a draft, and that was put out for open review. So anyone who contributed to the handbook was given full access to the document, and anyone could make editorial suggestions and so on. Published in July. In August, we put ourselves forward for a Open Education Global Research Award. And sort of since then, and up till November, I'm doing various presentations of this work, including OE Global and the Open Education Conference in the States coming up. So that's, if you like, how we put it together. So it's partly crowdsourced. About half of it is crowdsourced, and about half of it was written by myself and colleagues. So one of the key things that we were interested in was to try and make complex material accessible. And so just to sort of rewind a little bit, when we took on the GoGN project, we went through a bit of a rebranding exercise. And we did this with the artist who worked on the handbook, Brian Mathers, whose consultancy is called Visual Thinkery. So myself and colleagues had a session with him, which was a kind of mind mapping session. And there's a little bit of that here, where we were trying to work out, okay, what are we trying to do with this community in the future, and how do we want to sort of position ourselves, really? And you can see some of these ideas here: being an exciting network, having empathy for people, supporting them emotionally rather than just academically, promoting social justice, exploring openness, possibilities, being innovative, and so on. So from this exercise, we ended up with this kind of visual identity, which was all based around the kind of, there was a golden age of travel theme. So the idea was that partly, we facilitate people to travel to conferences and meet us and that kind of thing. So there is some literal travel, although again, 2020 had other ideas when it came to our travel plans. So it can seem slightly ironic, this branding now about movement and exploration and so on. Or you could see it as kind of prescient, because ultimately people are just doing the same sort of things but without that travel. So so anyway, we took this idea of this travel motif, and it was put together with penguins. And it might not be completely obvious at first why penguins, but we've kind of ended up with penguins as our unofficial / official mascot. And I think it started with, by chance. I think we were just getting some stuff printed with our logo, and they had penguins that we could print it on. But they were so popular, and it became such a kind of an association with the network, that we now shamelessly use the penguin as our kind of mascot. So, but the reason I mention it, and so one of the things that makes penguins attractive as a mascot is, first of all, they're kind of like gender neutral, and this was considered to be, a kind of positive thing, because it stopped us getting involved in, kind of gendered representations. Also, penguins come from the Global South, and promoting scholarship in the Global South is one of the key aims that we have. So the way this all kind of came together in the draft is the idea of the penguin's journey. So you see the penguin starts off on the iceberg on its own, and then it's the journey of the penguin, if you like, through the landscape of research methods is how it kind of is put together. Another thing that came with the sort of golden age of travel idea was the idea of passport stamps. So we have some sections, like the philosophical elements I mentioned previously, where we sort of suggest that it's like you just have to kind of get this stuff done, get your stamp, and then move on to the next thing, rather than getting kind of bogged down in it for 3 years or whatever. Using this kind of cartoon style to try to explain complex methods can be a bit of a challenge. And so I present one thing here, which is actually sort of quite complicated table. Putting some penguins and a rainbow in, I think, makes it a bit more, bit less intimidating, maybe. But what you can see here is the sort of spectrum of, I guess it's sort of metaphysical differences between different research paradigms. So on the one side, we have realism. Science reveals the truth about things, and our language about the world corresponds to the way it really is, and we can understand things quantitatively and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, you have more relativistic approaches, where we're more interested, I suppose we don't necessarily accept the idea that there's one objective truth about things. So we're really interested in trying to understand phenomenon, and we tend to use qualitative methods to do that. And so you have different methods underneath each of these kind of ends of the spectrum and in the middle. And there's quite a lot of stuff packed into this table. And if you were to put it in a purely text-based table, I think it is a bit overwhelming. Maybe it's still a bit overwhelming, but I think it's easier to kind of take in when you do it in a kind of interesting visual style. So we also have some images that we redrew from other people's work. So here you have an account of the research design process. This is based on a resource from a discontinued Open University course called E891. And so you see here, you move from an initial research question through the philosophical elements, here ontology, methodology, and epistemology. And then you get through to the sort of practical stuff, the design frame. How do you actually write the proposal for a study based on, these research paradigms and so on. So having this visual approach also let us recast other people's work. So where we found something that we thought was particularly interesting or particularly well done, we'd find a way to incorporate it that way. So let me just take you through the content of what's actually in the handbook. So first of all, we have these sections on the philosophical foundations, so ontology, epistemology, and axiology. It's quite common for method guides to talk about ontology and epistemology. They're actually pretty core philosophical concepts. One of the people do talk about axiology, but it's a relatively recent thing to make it an explicit part of method. And I think it's one that is particularly relevant to people who are interested in using open educational approaches as a route to social justice, for instance, where there's a very strong sense of someone's values and moral commitments coming through in their work, which, if you think back to more kind of traditional, let's say, science, the idea that your personal values should influence what you're doing is a bit of a no-no, right? Because you want your method to be as pure, in inverted commas, as possible. So I think this is quite a sort of interesting element, which is increasingly, I mean, just to explore this a little bit, from a more traditional perspective, you could say, well, the value that you should have is just to make sure that you're following method correctly, so that the outcomes and the conclusions that you draw are more reliable. So it's always still there at some level, this idea of a personal commitment or a sort of ethical commitment. But I think it makes sense to think about it more explicitly than has often been the case in the past. So we've got a section then on different paradigms in research, where paradigms in research come from, what paradigms are, and bearing in mind that you could write many books about any of these things, right? Many books about ontology, many books about epistemology and so on, many books about research paradigms. So we try to be as sort of concise as possible, to sit on the fence as much as possible and not take a particular position around things. And also just to put lots of links into other material where we feel like that's the best way to do it. So if you want to go a bit deeper into this, have a look here. So we then go on to look at different research methods that are associated with particular paradigms. So for instance, if you're coming from a sort of positivist paradigm, you're much more likely to be in quantitative work and so on. Interpretivism is more closely associated with qualitative work. And then I think this idea of a critical or transformational paradigm, again, it's not exactly that traditional, but I think it fits quite well with what a lot of open education researchers are actually trying to do, which is bring about some sort of meaningful change. And we also have sections on pragmatism as a research approach, which obviously is kind of theory light, or you're willing to sort of tolerate a certain amount of flexibility in order to get the thing done that you're trying to get done. And we also have some short sections on interdisciplinarity and using mixed methods and kind of triangulating data together. This is a redrawn table, slightly edited, but it kind of conveys how some of these paradigmatic differences relate to differences in the research methods process. So this one presents it as values being the kind of starting point. So what drives you, what matters to you, what are you trying to do in the world? And that being the sort of driving force behind the research process. Again, with penguins added. We also have a section in the handbook on open research and openness in research and what does it mean and why you might want to do it. And we look at different open practices and the idea of an open research cycle. So taking a traditional sort of scholarship cycle and making it open. What happens if you do that? What does it mean to do that? And it means you've got different options for dissemination, data collection, and so on. We also have a section which is sort of a bit more practically focused, which is looking at how to plan a research project, how to deal with ethical issues and risk, what kind of technologies people might use for data collection, analysis, and so on. And also some guidance on managing yourself as a researcher, because especially in doctoral research, it can go on for a long time and there can be setbacks and it can be quite demanding. So understanding that there's also an aspect of all this, which is just sort of self-management and getting the most out of yourself. And we also look at research design. So far, that's about the first half of the report. And then the second half is a summary of different specific methods, but with the insights offered by the researchers themselves. So the second half of the handbook is really made up of the contributions made by our members. So the specific methods that we have in this handbook, we have action research, case studies, doing content and thematic analysis, design-based research or interventions, kind of quite similar, discourse analysis, ethnography, evaluation research, or just doing evaluation on learning, which is quite common, experimental and quasi-experimental research, so where you have an experimental design, grounded theory, doing interviews and focus groups, doing a systematic literature review, using mixed methods, narrative research, which is based around the stories that people tell about what they do, observation, which can be sort of classrooms with observation or online and so on, phenomenography and phenomenology, which obviously fairly similar, but phenomenography is based in looking at writing, social network analysis, and doing surveys and questionnaires. So again, any one of these, there's been many books written about them. So when we present them in the handbook, we have to be a little bit sort of circumspect about it and not kind of oversimplify it, but also give someone a sort of reasonable way into understanding what is that method all about and why use it, and so on. Thinking about So first of all, I would say I can't do justice to present all of the insights that we collected in that process, and you really have to look at the handbook yourself and let the people's own individual words speak for themselves. But one thing we were interested in is, okay, well, when you look at all this stuff together and you look at how people work and what they do, can we sort of understand what's happening with open research itself, or can we get any insights into what it means? And I would say we sort of got more than halfway there in terms of having a model for how it might work. And so the kind of things that came up were, for instance, working agilely and sort of collaborating agilely, having an agile project management process, having an interest in directly influencing practices in their own institutions quite a lot of the time. Working in a sort of radically transparent way. So there is no on the inside to what you're doing. You just kind of share everything. It could be blogs, it could be social media or whatever. But you have a kind of open approach to what you're doing. I think one idea that came up was the idea that open researchers are more likely to use their own networks as a resource for doing research. And that could be a kind of just, asking questions on Twitter or something like that, but also using them as a way of collecting data and incorporating that into their research. Increasingly, people are more likely to share their research instruments, so things they've developed in the course of doing their research, like a survey template or focus group talking points and that kind of thing. It's becoming more common to share those, often on an open license, which allows others to make use of them, but also to tailor them to their own needs and potentially share them back to the community. As you might expect, quite a lot of use of open data, a tendency towards open access publication. And we also find that there's a lot of interest in using technologies and technological innovations in their research. And as I say, there's this kind of very explicit interest, which is not universal in open education research, but it's quite common for people to identify with a sense of social justice with what the research work that they do. So I think this is a kind of, this is a sort of developing, emergent picture when it comes to trying to understand or define how open research differs from more traditional elements. And I'm not suggesting that everyone does all of these things, but these are the kind of indicators, if you like, that we've come to associate with open research. So yeah, on that theme, I just want to share with you some of the prompts that we've included in the handbook. So try to encourage people to think about the ways in which their research is sort of framed or motivated. And so this is what, if you like, at the level of, it's a slightly meta level, reflective level. How do you understand what you're doing? So it could be that what you're trying to do is just to describe what's happening, who's taking MOOCs. You could be trying to identify a pattern. And so these are examples from within the network. You may be interested in changing an existing narrative. For instance, the digital native idea is heavily criticized these days. You might want to say something's been overlooked in existing research. You might want to say, I need to support professional practice in my institution. How do I do that? And so that's the underlying thing motivating your research. And then, it could just be that you want to develop new theories, describe new trends, and identify kind of new things as they're coming out. I think we often tend not to sit back and think, why am I doing this? What is the thing that I'm trying to achieve? Partly because we tend to frame research in terms of domain areas, right? I'm interested in this stuff, rather than the kind of practical level. What is it that you're trying to actually do with this research? And so another way of thinking about it is to say, what's the value of answering your research question, right? What does it matter if we answer your research question? And if the answer is it doesn't really matter, well, okay, like sometimes that's how research goes. Like some interests are purely academic, let's say. And as someone with a background in philosophy, I can relate to that, right? There's a lot of philosophical stuff where, you know, it doesn't really matter that much. It doesn't have a practical application, at least not an immediate one. But I think I'm not, you know, I still think that kind of research can have a lot of value. But an important question for researchers to ask themselves is, what's the value of answering this question? And a sort of related question to that is, if I use open approaches, does that add value to the thing that I'm doing? So if the thing that I'm trying to do is influence practice or change policy or something like that, can an open approach help me with that? If I'm trying to build research capacity in a particular area, does producing tools or data for others to use add value to that? And probably it does. So I think one question that cuts across open research is this idea of understanding the added value that openness can bring. So we published in July, I think, and we were quite pleased with the uptake. So I think last month we'd had more than 4,000 downloads. I confess I'm not sure where we're up to now, but as we've only got kind of 300 members, that seemed like pretty good going. And it seemed to me that we tapped into something there was a bit of a need for generally, where, and I think, as I said, method generally is complicated and people need support with it. There's a massive amount of literature out there on research methods, but not all of it is that accessible. So one thing we found was that people were sharing it as a kind of general introduction to research method rather than an introduction to open education research. All of the images that were produced are themselves available on an open license, so others can use those images as long as they give attribution. So they're finding their way into lots of people's presentations at the moment. And the Research Methods Handbook itself is also available CC BY, so people can use it freely and do what they want to do with it. So with our original kind of conception, the Research Methods Handbook is just a part of the research output that we want to produce in this phase of the project. So firstly, I think next year we intend to produce a companion volume, but it will be focused on theories and theoretical perspectives. So if you like, less practical, but giving the kind of grounding that people need to be able to feel confident in doing the kind of practical stuff. And again, this is something that's a response to demand from members. But I think I would also like to do a future edition of this handbook next year. So on the whole, we had very positive feedback, but we did have a couple of people who sort of pointed to bits and said, look, you know, this isn't the way that I think it should be done. It should be more like this. And I think this is great from the point of view of, you know, openness and improving the document. We can include that kind of feedback and ask people, okay, well, would you like to write something better? You know, that would be great, because we're not claiming to have a perfect understanding of research methods. Some of the things I would like to include. So firstly, we could have more contributions from our researchers, so more methods and more experiences shared of using particular methods. I think we could include some extra stuff in the main discussion especially around methods that are used in the USA and other places to do research into open textbooks or the COOP framework, where they're doing impact research for adoption of OER and open textbooks in colleges and universities. And that's kind of not really in this edition, but I think it's an important part of the overall picture for what people are doing. I think building on this outline of what open research practice looks like and how it differs, I think we could get further with that. I mean, it's also been requested that we give some more specific guidance for designing research. So rather than just talking about method in kind of slightly abstract philosophical language, also saying, okay, so once you've chosen your approach, here's how to design the research at a very sort of granular level. I'd say there's a limit to how far we could go with that, because again, there's books and books and books written on this stuff. But I see this handbook as a kind of living document, which is completely open to future revisions. And it's actually built into its DNA as an openly licensed resource. But I think we could even do an annual edition potentially, and just kind of keep growing this resource, and keep making it a better tool for people to use. If you're particularly interested in the penguins or the visual style, you may be interested in this recently published article where myself and the artist just reflect a bit on the use of these kind of cartoons in an academic kind of handbook, and talk through some of the decisions that were made about different graphics and that kind of thing. And that's a nice little spin-off. There's again some interest in that, and just how do we approach some of this complex stuff with less experienced researchers. So there's a whole special issue of this journal, International Journal of Management and Applied Research, which is all about the use of visual representation in higher education. We also have another recent output, which was produced in a similar way, a similar sort of crowdsourced way. But this time the idea was to produce a critical review of recently published research in the field of open education. And so we had a bunch of reviewers from different countries, and we collectively reviewed about, I think it was about 20 or so recent articles. So summer edition was published in August, and we should be doing a winter edition most likely around January. And the idea is to do 6 of these research reviews over the life of the project, so that when you put them all together, again, you have a useful starting point for people who are doing research in this area, where they can go, okay, if I read these 6 research reviews, I've got a bit of a grounding in the last 3 years of what's been published, but also I can see the kind of critical reactions from my peers to see how they responded to this research. So there's the research reviews will be compiled, but then also the handbooks will be compiled. So we'll have method, theory, maybe something else, I'm not quite sure yet, maybe research design. So the idea is that at the end of this phase of GoGN, there will be some really useful research outputs that were very much produced by the network rather than just by us as researchers in the UK. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you to the people who contributed to the handbook. I won't go through all of the names because there's quite a few of them, but they all wrote about how they've used different research methods, and that information was used to put together the second half of the handbook. So very grateful to for everyone's contributions and for everyone's insights, which hopefully we're now able to share to a much wider audience. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. But I'm happy to have some questions or have a bit of a chat. We've still got about 10 minutes, I think. So thank you for your attention.
Well, I think first things first is to say, just thank you for a wonderful, enlightening presentation from Dr. Farrow. It certainly does reflect the amount of effort and work that him and his colleagues have been putting into open and open education globally, to be honest. I don't know, are there any questions from anyone in attendance at the moment? You're welcome to unmute yourselves at this point if you do want to ask a question. Rob, I think that just as people are maybe considering questions or thinking about it, I'd like to pose something. Okay, wait. Yeah, Prof. Potas has made a comment. I'll just read it out. Thanks for the presentation. My postgraduate students tend to struggle with the philosophical aspects, especially those in the taught masters, which is a professional qualification where they deal with taught modules as well as the research treatise. There is less time to wallow in the methodological aspects. We tend to reverse engineer back to the philosophical aspects once we identify the methods, that's data collection and analysis. This book is very useful as a concise but comprehensive overview and introduction. I agree, Prof. Rob, would you like to say something about that comment, perhaps?
So yeah, I mean, as I acknowledged, it's definitely an issue for, I think, almost all graduate students. And I think it's partly because you don't really get exposed to it before that. And you might get a bit of a grounding in using a particular method for a particular end. But mostly people want to sidestep some of this philosophical stuff, which I totally get, right? I'm probably more comfortable with this kind of stuff because I have a background in philosophy. So talking about ontology or epistemology, that's basically what you do for 3 years as an undergraduate. So it occurs to me that it would be good to start people off a bit sooner with a bit more of the basics of philosophy. So I'm a bit biased, right? But I don't think it's the methods that confuse people, it's the philosophical differences. Because the real difficulty is, where do you start? Where's your foundational point in philosophy? And again, many books have been written about that. I think for the purposes of most bits of graduate level research, even doctoral, you're not going to solve these problems, right? You're not going to come to a final solution as to whether a particular method is the best or whatever. Mostly what success will be just establishing that you've acknowledged the complexity, acknowledged the fact that these are debates that kind of continue, but you have to make a practical decision in order to do a research project in a reasonable time frame. So you don't have to solve all the issues of research method, but you have to be able to show that you understand what they are and where they arise from. So I think that's a quite subtle difference, because if your starting point is, look, I just don't feel like I understand methods well enough to be able to do this work. Well, if the framing instead is, I understand that this is really complicated and there's compromises, but I need to do it this way, I think that's fine personally, because it's more about acknowledging the complexity and then just cracking on, rather than getting really bogged down in 2,000 years of metaphysics. So yeah, I totally appreciate that. And I don't think there's an easy answer to it in a way, but what does seem to be appreciated is the idea that make it as simple as possible, which admittedly in some cases is not that simple anyway.
Thank you, Rob. I see there that you have a message of agreement to your statement now.
I'm still
I
trying
actually have
to
a question,
answer
and
the
I'd
question.
just like to just go somewhere a bit further away from the handbook, if you permit me. My question is, how do you suggest like an institution like Mandela University, where open hasn't yet been widely embraced? I mean, if we look at attendance here, compared to other webinars that myself and my unit offer, attendance is relatively poor when compared to that. However, how do you suggest, or do you have any sort of insights into ways that we could start infusing it into sort of the wider research community or activities or efforts?
Yeah. So what tends to happen with open approaches generally is that it starts off with an advocate or an influencer, to use the local terminology. It generally speaking starts with a person and a problem. And so the problem is the institution's problem, right? And it could be, for instance, how can we provide people with educational materials more cheaply, or something like that? How can we enable educators to be more innovative in what they're doing? And so then openness can be presented as the kind of solution to a problem. It doesn't really cost anything, except people's time. And so working out that sort of value proposition, which is going to be a local one, right? It's going to be different in different institutions and different people and that kind of thing. But understanding, okay, what's the value that you can add by being open? And it could be in terms of collaboration, it could be in terms of kind of making the most of existing efforts and existing stuff that's been produced. How do we make the most of that, where you could reversion it and that kind of thing? I would say it's all about the value proposition that you can put together, but you need local knowledge to be able to kind of frame it in the right way. But that seems to be the thing that gets the ear of managers and people who make decisions, because you can say, look, here's the thing, here's the problem that you've got, and here's the solution, and it's not really going to cost you anything to explore it. So that seems to be the kind of formula that has the most impact, as far as I can tell.
It's a great answer, and I'm happy you use the word influencers, because I can segue nicely back into just a suggestion that attendees and whoever watches this as a resource in future just refers back to our website here at Mandela Uni. It's the OpenEdInfluencers.mandela.ac.za. And we really are trying to make efforts to infuse open into our practice as well. Are there any other questions, perhaps? I see that Matilda Smith, who is the director of the Mandela University Law Clinic, has put a comment there, a question. Matilda, would you like to switch your microphone on, perhaps, and direct it yourself?
Hi, sorry. Do you want me to read the question? So the area that I work in, so it's very practical. It's a law clinic in terms of which we do live cases. The research work that gets done in that area tends to approach it from standpointism. And I was wondering if you had anything in that respect that was available in Open.
So I'm not aware of anyone specifically using that term and doing work. I know there's a lot of scholars who are doing sort of feminist work using open and using kind of open approaches as a route to social justice generally. That can mean different things to different people. But specifically standpointism I have not really heard that phrase much. The place I would go to would be FemEdTech, because that's a kind of informal group for people who are interested in feminist perspectives in educational technology. And so the people who are kind of gravitating around that space, they would probably be the ones to go to for that. But I think it's just a sort of terminology thing. I haven't really heard many people talk about standpointism. But maybe perspectivism would be a similar kind of framing. So yeah, I don't really hear it very much, but FemEdTech is where I would go if I wanted to kind of explore that in more detail.
Thank you, Rob. Matilda, thank you for your question. Rob, Matilda is also one of our OE for BW program project leaders and is busy working on a resource in plain language for legal terminology, a glossary of multilingual terms translated into different languages for South African use. So it's quite an exciting thing to have her as part of our university as well, and pushing open as one of the projects. We have some more messages. Selwyn says, thank you for an insightful presentation. And Humphrey says, thank you, it's very helpful. I think that from our side, it is 1 minute to 2 o'clock. We said this would be 1 hour. I'd like to pass along my thanks once again for you taking the time and the effort to be well, so supportive of our endeavors here at Mandela University with the OpenEdInfluencers, with Open Education for a Better World, being our mentor for the last 2 years. I see Kelly, who's one of our influencers here at the universities, put on another link there also related to FemEdTech. We will be taking a break from the series for next week and be back on the 14th and then the 21st, which is when one of the contributors to the Open Handbook, Glenda Cox from UCT and the Digital Open Textbooks for Development, or DOT4D project, will be presenting about the exciting work that they are doing there at UCT with open textbooks and having faculty actually be co-creators along with others of the resources that will be freely available to their students. Rob, if you have any final words that you'd like to say as a means of saying goodbye, over to you.
Well, just say to everyone, thanks for having me. Thanks for your attention. I think all of this sort of open stuff is stuff that we can all explore it together, right? No one owns this stuff. And the best way to do it is just to get involved and start practically doing things and speaking to people, making connections, and it's a very welcoming community. So yeah, just get out and do stuff. That's my advice.
Thank you so much. And from all of us here at Mandela University, to you, we say goodbye, and I say goodbye to everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and see you on the 14th, I hope.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.